Good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to see an industry so enthusiastic that they would congregate at 7 a.m. The other interpretation is they would go anywhere for a breakfast. Right, so it does wonders for your confidence to be described as from a parallel universe. My confidence is already shaken. I spoke last week on the same thing in Europe, and I arrived at a very big hotel in Germany. I was a little bit nervous. I asked the receptionist where the conference was, and she pointed down a corridor. And I looked down the corridor, and everyone there looked like they'd walked straight out of a Ralph Lauren advert. And I thought, this is terrible. European farmer is very cool. British farmer kind of looks like this, much less cool. And as I got down there, it turns out it was the Ralph Lauren Europe conference. And so I feel a bit more comfortable today, and I'm really pleased to be here on what is a fascinating subject. And I think, hopefully, I will learn a lot about some of the challenges in this area your industry faces, and happy to share some thoughts from ours. So if we look at the landscape of reputation in recent years, we've had many things. We've seen seismic shifts in societal expectations and stakeholder expectations of who we are as businesses and how we operate and how we work. So whether it's the financial crisis, the MP's expenses issue in our own industry, we had the launch of Bad Pharma, which I'll talk about a little bit later, all things that have really shifted people's perceptions of who we are, of financial relationships between people, about how we operate. And no longer are we at all about just the thing that we sell. We're about who we are and how we get there. And does it matter, was a question we asked. So, our industry is pretty successful, the pharmaceutical industry. There's always an inherent tension between profit and healthcare, so that causes its own challenges. But as Malcolm said, there are a whole range where, when discussing this with CEOs of pharma companies, both in the UK and globally, that whether it is the legislative environment, whether it's investment, whether it's the threat of increased regulation, whether it's our ability to collaborate with, whether it's the NHS, academia, other companies, other sectors, biotech, devices, and so on, that has a real reputation, that has a real direct impact on all of these issues. And Malcolm mentioned just being able to attract and retain the best staff, the best academics for our R&D. It has a huge impact on those kind of issues. So, what are our issues then? Well, if you ask people from most companies, this tends to be the perception of the pharma industry. So on the research and development side, then everyone's seen as championing a changing healthcare landscape. You have to look at the HIV story, the eradication of the need for surgery and for ulcers by using oral medication, all these stories that have been transformed by the R&D side of the industry. But if you talk to the people about the sales and marketing side of the industry, which funds the other bit, then there is a little bit of a different perception. But we had to go further in really understanding at the start of this work about what the issues were. And I won't go through this in detail. I love the reputation stuff. I get quite geeky about it. I can usually tell because people glaze over slightly. This was a big research that we did with the industry that looked amongst our main the people that we were interested in talking to about what their drivers of reputation were, how we performed, and how important those things were to the individuals. So actually how we perform is the blue bar, and how important it is to the green bar, and it's too small to see, but basically ethics was our key one, where the biggest gap was. So we had to look more at what ethics meant. And things like financial performance, we did really well at, but no one cared about. So we had a real challenge there about how do we narrow the gap between our performance from a reputational perspective and the things that were important to the stakeholders that we wanted to discuss and talk with and work with. And it's crucial that you know who those groups are. Because reputation is everything from the first hello in the morning to the last tired email. It's every interaction you have. It's the way you negotiate price. It's your corporate social. It is everything. So to have an impact, we felt, in particular from our industry, we needed to identify exactly who counted in terms of our reputation. So, is it the public? Is it pressure groups, as we have up there? Is it media, or is it governmental? That impacts on the strategy that you then adopt and how you do that together. There were some, when we first looked at it, there were some great suggestions about doing things that just said, we're now lovely, you can trust us more, and if you'd like to hug us on the way out, that's fine. And it wasn't a very complex approach, I suppose. And one of the things that we identified early is that actually our issues tend to be issues that are shared by a number of stakeholders. And actually, you can't just vocalize this on your own. You need shared ownership of those issues, and you need the solutions to be delivered in partnership. And we now work with I think about 18 healthcare professional bodies, the devices industry, and so on, in holistic, I suppose, kind of work streams, very proactive in addressing some of these issues, but doing it in partnership. So we have to be clear as well on what is the perception of your industry and what's the reality. So this isn't my last holiday. This was the picture used a few months ago by the Daily Mail to illustrate an article on medical education. And I clearly, judging by this, get invited to the wrong conferences because I have never been to such a venue. The Code of Practice, the ABPI Code of Practice, which is a cracking read if any of you have got some spare time, it has transformed how we operate. So, venues need to be appropriate, the educational content is et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The days of this kind of stuff have gone, but the perception is very real. And if the perception is there from a reputational perspective, you still have the problem. So some things will be a perception issue and other things will be a reality issue. And they need different approaches. So it might be, if it's a perception issue or it's a way the business model just needs to work, you have to explain it differently, and that's communication. There are other areas where our industry has got it superbly wrong in recent decades and in past decades, and that's required behavioural change. And the third area, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think is where society moves in its expectations, and that requires a response. And I think transparency, in our case, is one of those big issues where we've seen a big shift in a small space of time. I would encourage you in these kind of issues to speak with a single voice, because if you are talking about a reputational issue, then actually different voices with different messages make people wonder why that is and what is the difference and why is that occurring. The second thing is you can invest a fortune as an individual company, but if your neighbour makes a pig's breakfast of it, actually all of you collectively get reputational damage from this. So if there's one area where collective action is really beneficial, then I think it's this reputational space. And so we had, recently we changed the Code of Practice so that companies would disclose our aggregate totals of all the monies paid to health professionals in the UK and the number of health professionals that they worked in. That big step in the transparency journey. So actually we collected, I was laughing, it was a big complex industry, and it ended up, the disclosures were all sent to me because everyone wanted very confidential. So I was sitting with my feet up on the dog with a calculator adding it all up. It's not particularly high tech, but it meant that there was one point of communication. And so that's, we then communicated that as an industry, and it meant that it was managed. It meant that there were the same messages going out about why we work with health professionals, what the benefit to patients were, the benefit to science, the benefit to medicine. Use that single voice. We have to have a long-term vision, a long-term strategy around the reputational work. Where do we want to be as an industry in 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? But that said, things can drop into that mix, and Ben Goldacre, who is a fascinating journalist and an excellent communicator, he wrote the one on the left, the one on the right I kind of amended slightly. But this landed right in the middle and was very high profile. And it crystallized, or polarized, I should say, the sort of debate around transparency, clinical trials and so on, into, well, you're either for full clinical transparency, the Luke Skywalker end, or you're not. And actually, the debate was very, very different to that, because it was like, who supports world peace? Everyone supports greater transparency. But the difference was those that are accountable for delivering it had a lot more to think about on the way through. So some lessons quickly. Well, the first thing that was crucial is to really listen and to really understand the criticisms of our industry and acknowledge where the mistakes have been made. Now, lots of these were done, or issues that have been running for a number of years, and we've had the opportunity to address them. You need to understand the scale of response. So Ben has 250,000 followers on Twitter, for example. So that, understand how quickly some of these things can kind of move forward. Around the clarity and simplicity of message, this was one thing that we really learned quickly and learned early, because they said, well, actually a lot of trial data is missing and it should be made public, and that was the only message. And our message was, lots of trial data goes to the regulator, it's in different digital formats, we need to format it, some of it will add value to the player, etc., etc., etc. All valid, but less clear to the public and to one of our audiences about why that was. The other one was burden of proof, and this thing we learned really quickly, that if you say anything against particularly a big industry, you can pretty much make it up. If we say anything in defense, then you have an enormous burden of proof to do that, and you need the resources to be able to analyze things that are said about your industry, but also to be able to build a body of evidence that supports the case for your industry. And speed of response we've spoken about. Some of the things that have now started to turn that around is engagement. So if you have a campaign or a publicity thing, it's one thing. But actually being seen to be proactive, engaged with stakeholders on the issues that matter, and you know what they are because you'll have done the research, that is the key to moving things forward. You need to understand the argument. It doesn't tend to be about do we do this or not. If there's a hegemony of support, if there's a feeling that the direction of travel is right, focus on the how that you do that. And a roadmap for that is incredibly useful. You need, as an industry, and I know Paul's going to speak about, to tell your stories. I am the least technical person in pretty much the entire pharma industry, which is why they send me out to speak at various places, I'm sure. But you need to articulate the human stories behind your industry and how that operates. Because if we talk in ours about late phase clinical trials and this and that, they're all crucial. But actually it's not what lights people's fire. And these two beautiful little ones, that's Aoife on the left, who's my little girl, and Hamish on the right. So they, I should say, are fine before we go on. But they stopped breathing 67 times in their first 3 weeks. They had 5 lots of surgery, and I counted 78 different interventions from members of the ABPI. And I hadn't long started at the ABPI. So if you're AstraZeneca, you made the heart medicine. If you're AbbVie, you made the Synergist that kept their lungs healthy. If you're Pfizer, you made the nutrition stuff that took them from this to this. So this is them just now as they just went to sort of, these are the stories of our industry. You need to find the voice of your industry, and you need to do that as part of this campaign. It is frustrating to us that we invest, we create, we innovate, we drive healthcare, we extend lives, we change the quality of people's lives. We have to make a profit to do that, to continue to do that, and the perception is continually challenging. Be proactive in your reputation management. Drive it because it impacts on everything that you do. Thank you very much.